You've handed us a source today that really opens up a world few truly understand. GURPS Martial Arts. Now, you might think this is just about fighting, but we're about to explore a tapestry woven with history, philosophy, and incredible human dedication.
Yeah, it's much more than just kicks and punches.
This deep dive is going to take us through centuries and across cultures.
That's right. Your sources offer a fantastic overview, touching on martial arts from China, Korea, Japan, stretching into places like Indonesia, Burma, France, and Italy, even considering fictional style.
Wow, okay, so quite the scope.
Definitely. We'll see how these arts developed within different historical contexts, shaped by beliefs like Taoism and Buddhism, influencing everything from training methods to their portrayal in law and popular culture.
Right.
We're also going to look at the line between what's realistic and, what we see on the silver screen.
Good distinction. So our goal today is to really dig into this wealth of information and pull out the most fascinating insights for you. We want to give you a genuine appreciation for the depth and breadth of martial arts, hopefully giving you some real aha moments without making it feel like homework.
Let's do it.
Let's dive in. And where better to begin than with some foundational stories?
Absolutely. A figure who really stands out at the beginning of martial arts history is Bodhidharma. Around 448 AD, legend tells us he journeyed from India to China.
Bodhidharma, right.
His story is quite something. A prince who became a Buddhist priest, driven to share his particular understanding of Buddhism, which would eventually become Zen or Chan.
Okay.
This drive led him on this incredible journey to China.
And his arrival wasn't exactly met with open arms, was it? I mean, I read that he pretty much told the Chinese emperor that all his grand projects were mundane and worthless.
Yeah, pretty blunt. Quite the entrance.
So what happened after that bold statement?
Well, following that rather direct assessment, Bodhidharma made his way to the Shaolin Temple. At that time, the monks there were primarily focused on translating sacred Indian texts into Chinese.
Okay.
Initially, Bodhidharma was refused entry. But then the story takes this amazing turn. He is said to have sat in unwavering meditation, facing a cliff wall for 9 years.
9 years. Facing a wall.
9 years. The intensity of his focus was so great, the legend says, that he actually bored a hole through the rock with his gaze.
Whoa, seriously?
Well, that's the legend. This incredible display of dedication finally convinced the temple leader to welcome him, and Bodhidharma became their spiritual leader.
9 years staring at a wall. It's beyond dedication. It's almost mythical. But Shaolin wasn't just about spiritual teachings, right? This is where the connection to martial arts comes in.
Exactly. Bodhidharma is also credited with introducing a series of exercises to the monks. Now, it's important to understand that these weren't initially for fighting. They were designed to build the monks' physical stamina, to help them endure the very demanding mental and physical discipline of their monastic life. Think of it as a way to survive the lifestyle itself.
So it was about building endurance for their rigorous daily routine, not preparing for battle.
Precisely. However, as often happens, things evolve. Over time, these exercises became intertwined with self-defense techniques at the Shaolin Temple.
Okay.
This eventually developed into what became known as Shaolin Chuanfa, or the Way of the Shaolin Fist. It gained incredible prestige, both as a challenge to defeat a Shaolin monk and as a mark of honor to be accepted into the temple.
Right.
Neither, as you can imagine, was easily achieved.
I bet. That makes a lot of sense. So from exercises designed for monastic life, a renowned fighting style emerged. Fascinating. Now, your sources also highlight some key philosophical influences on martial arts, especially Taoism. What's the central impact of Taoism here?
A core principle of Taoism that has deeply shaped martial arts is Wu Wei.
Wu Wei, right, non-action.
Often translated that way, yeah, but it's not about being passive or doing nothing. Instead, Wu Wei emphasizes acting without conscious intent, without forcing things.
Wow.
The idea is that our selfish desires and deliberate efforts can actually hinder the natural flow of things. By removing that conscious struggle, actions become more spontaneous and harmonious, aligning with the natural order. Think of a plant growing. It doesn't consciously strive, it simply grows.
So it's about a kind of effortless action that comes from not trying too hard. How does that translate into a physical confrontation?
In martial arts, Wu Wei can manifest as passive achievement. Instead of directly meeting force with force, a Taoist approach might involve yielding to an opponent's energy, not resisting it, and then redirecting that energy.
Like a keto or something.
Sort of, yeah. It's about being adaptable, like water flowing around obstacles rather than a rigid dam trying to block the flow.
Okay, I think I'm getting a clearer picture. Go with the flow, not just metaphorically. The source also mentions that Taoism is very individualistic. How does that fit with the often structured and disciplined nature of martial arts training?
That's a crucial point. Taoism is indeed a very personal path, and how someone embodies living in harmony with nature can vary greatly. For some, like Lao Tzu, it might mean withdrawing from the world.
Right.
For others, it could mean bringing harmony to the world in their own way, perhaps even through the discipline of martial arts. The source actually points out that the somewhat complex and personal nature of Taoist concepts might be why it's not as widely followed as Buddhism in some Eastern cultures, but its influence among martial artists is undeniable.
Interesting. So this idea of aligning with a natural flow and acting without forced intent has a real connection to martial arts, even with its individualistic core. Now, the other major philosophical influence you mentioned is Buddhism. How does that shape these practices?
Buddhism, in contrast to Taoism's more individual focus, has a significant link to internal martial arts. These styles often emphasize spiritual development as being intertwined with physical training.
Okay, internal arts.
The core principles often involve concepts like yielding to an opponent's force and redirecting it, rather than directly opposing it. It's about finding strength through yielding.
So similar in that aspect of not directly confronting force, but with a different underlying emphasis on spiritual growth.
Precisely. The focus in Buddhist-influenced martial arts often includes cultivating inner peace, developing a strong spiritual center, and applying those principles to the physical practice.
Makes sense.
The source specifically mentions Tai Chi Chuan, Aikido, and Pakua as examples of purely internal styles that draw heavily from Buddhist principles.
Right, those styles often have a very flowing, yielding quality to them. Okay, so we've explored some of the origins and the philosophical underpinnings. Now, what about the practical side? What did it actually take to become a truly dedicated martial artist, according to these sources?
Well, the source really emphasizes the intense dedication required. Let's revisit that Shaolin Temple initiation for a moment.
Oh yeah, that sounded intense.
It wasn't just about mastering specific fighting techniques. The final test involved navigating a complex maze filled with all sorts of dummies and hidden mechanical traps.
A maze with traps. Seriously.
Yeah, a student had to successfully evade and parry every single attack, and apparently many monks would fail this stage multiple times. It was a true test of reflexes and learned skills under pressure.
A booby-trapped maze. Sounds like something out of an adventure film. And if a student managed to get through that...
If they successfully navigated the maze, the final challenge was even more formidable. A massive metal cauldron, weighing around 500 pounds.
500 pounds.
Heated until it was red hot and filled with burning coals.
You're kidding.
Nope. To complete the initiation, the student had to lift this searingly hot cauldron and carry it out of the testing area.
Lift a red-hot cauldron.
And in the process, they would receive permanent brandings of a dragon and a tiger on their forearms, marking them as full members of the Shaolin Temple.
Wow. Talk about a final exam. That's not just a test of physical ability. It's a profound test of willpower and the ability to endure extreme pain for their commitment.
Exactly.
It really underscores that becoming a martial artist, at least in these traditions, was a deeply serious life commitment.
Absolutely. The source makes it clear that becoming a true martial artist wasn't seen as a casual hobby. It demanded years of substantial life dedication, often beginning in the late teens at the latest.
Not just a few classes a week, then.
No way. The idea of attending a class a couple of times a week and considering oneself a true martial artist is presented as quite unlikely. It's about a profound and ongoing commitment to physical, mental, and sometimes spiritual development that becomes an integral part of one's life.
That really provides a new perspective. It's not just about learning a set of moves. It's about a fundamental transformation through incredibly rigorous training. Now let's zoom out and consider the broader cultural and historical context. Your sources explore martial arts in various cultures. Let's start with Japan and the samurai. What were their primary martial skills?
In feudal Japan, the core martial skills of the samurai, the warrior class, were primarily swordsmanship and archery.
Sword and bow. Got it.
Their training, known as bujutsu, heavily emphasized these weapon-based arts. While they also learned other weapon skills like using the naginata, spear, and various types of knives, the focus was overwhelmingly on the blade and the bow.
So those dramatic katana duels we see in historical dramas are pretty accurate in terms of their central importance.
Yes, the mastery of the sword was paramount for a samurai. Interestingly, empty hand techniques were considered secondary.
Really? Secondary.
Yeah. While they did learn some forms of grappling and close quarters combat, it was nowhere near the level of emphasis placed on their weaponry. The logic was quite practical. A samurai would almost always have at least his short sword readily available.
True.
So the opportunities to engage in unarmed combat were relatively infrequent.
That makes perfect sense. Why rely on your bare hands if you're carrying a finely crafted, razor-sharp sword? The source also touches on the concept of seppuku. Where does that fit into the samurai's martial ethos?
Seppuku, or ritual suicide, was a deeply ingrained aspect of the samurai's honor code. To betray one's lord was considered an unpardonable offense, bringing immense shame upon oneself and one's family.
A huge deal.
Seppuku was the prescribed way to atone for such a transgression. It was also required of samurai who were deemed to have failed in their duties in a significant way. It's a stark illustration of the incredibly intense code of conduct that governed their lives. Interestingly, the source points out a bit of a paradox. While betraying a lord demanded seppuku, many powerful nobles within the samurai class themselves didn't always adhere to the same strict standards when it came to betraying even higher authorities, like the emperor or the shogun.
That's a fascinating and somewhat ironic observation about the complexities of power and honor. Now, let's turn our attention to another iconic figure in Japanese martial arts, the ninja. What were their origins, according to the source?
The origins of the ninja are actually subject to some debate, with two main theories presented in the source.
Oh, two theories.
One theory posits that they emerged from warriors and clan leaders who had been on the losing side of Japan's frequent power struggles. These individuals, already skilled in the arts of war, adapted and developed unconventional guerrilla tactics and covert operations, essentially, some of the earliest forms of specialized espionage and sabotage.
So their development was almost a survival mechanism in a volatile political landscape.
Precisely. They became masters of what we would now call asymmetric warfare.
Okay, and the second theory?
The second theory offers a different perspective, suggesting that the ninja's origins can be traced back to Chinese cults who migrated to Japan.
Chinese cults.
Yeah. These groups purportedly possessed a diverse range of martial arts knowledge, which they employed for espionage, assassination, and cultivating a reputation as shadowy, highly skilled agents.
Chinese cults as the origin of the ninja. That's a surprising angle. Regardless of their exact beginnings, what were their key skills and primary focus?
Well, regardless of which origin theory holds more weight, the source emphasizes that the ninja relied less on sheer martial arts prowess and more on skills like acting, disguise, and various forms of trickery.
The deception part?
Stealth and deception were their defining characteristics. However, it's important to remember that they did possess martial arts abilities, which they often used in conjunction with their other specialized skills. Think of it as martial arts being one tool in a much larger and more diverse toolbox.
So more about cunning and operating in the shadows than just direct combat strength.
Exactly. They were masters of infiltration and subterfuge, using martial arts as one component of their extensive repertoire. Now, shifting our focus back to China, the destruction of the Shaolin Temple is presented as a very significant event. What led to this, and what were the lasting consequences?
Yeah, that sounds like a real turning point.
It was indeed. The source details that the Shaolin Temple was eventually destroyed, and as the Manchu dynasty further destabilized Chinese society, martial artists were forced to scatter across the countryside.
Okay, so they spread out.
Some used their skills to earn a living as teachers, while others unfortunately resorted to banditry. Importantly, these scattered schools often became centers of dissent where anti-imperial sentiments were nurtured.
Political centers, too.
Yeah, and they also played significant roles within their local communities, sometimes acting as volunteer security forces, providing charitable aid, and in some instances, even becoming the de facto local governing bodies.
So these martial arts schools evolved into much more than just places of combat training.
Absolutely. They became important social and political hubs, offering community support and sometimes even resistance to the ruling powers.
Right.
The destruction of the Shaolin Temple and the subsequent dispersal of martial artists also contributed to the rise of triads, tongs, and other secret societies, which often had their roots in these displaced martial arts communities.
A fascinating connection between martial arts, social upheaval, and the formation of these clandestine organizations. Now let's circle back to Japan and the evolution of their martial arts traditions. The source mentions a significant shift in the 19th century. What brought about that change?
The source points out that the martial arts, as we largely recognize them in Japan today, really began to solidify towards the end of the 19th century. As the traditional weapon skills of the samurai class evolved into more formalized do forms, think of the way of the sword becoming kendo.
Right, the do forms.
There was a tendency towards increasing specialization. Schools began to focus on a single weapon, or even a very specific aspect of using that weapon as an aikido, which concentrates solely on the art of drawing and resheathing the katana.
Okay, hyper-specialization.
Exactly. However, alongside this trend, there was also a notable rise in the prominence of empty hand schools.
What factors led to this increased focus on unarmed combat?
Several key factors contributed to this shift. The Meiji government in the 19th century implemented restrictions on weapon carrying for commoners,
Legal changes.
which naturally made unarmed combat skills more relevant for self-defense in everyday life. Additionally, around this time, some Chinese martial arts teachers began to arrive in Japan, bringing with them their chuan fa, or boxing techniques.
So Chinese influence again.
Yes, these were then adapted and integrated into Japanese martial arts, eventually becoming known as Kempo in Japanese. While Jiu-Jitsu was already an established Japanese martial art, it also experienced some later influence from these Chinese methods.
Interesting blend.
These new and evolving skills, emphasizing unarmed combat, were broadly categorized under the umbrella of jiu-jitsu, often translated as the gentle or supple art, although it initially included some weapon techniques as well, and ekidutsu.
So it was a combination of government regulations, the influence of martial arts from China, and the ongoing evolution of existing Japanese traditions that led to the development of the Japanese martial arts we are more familiar with today. Now let's turn our attention to the Indonesian archipelago. What does the source tell us about the martial arts that developed there?
The source describes the Malay people, who form the core population across the Malaysian archipelago, as having a long history as fierce warriors with strong animistic traditions.
Okay.
They were known for practices such as headhunting and ritual cannibalism.
Whoa, headhunting.
Yeah, which paints a picture of a culture deeply rooted in combat and ritual warfare.
Definitely not a region known for peaceful passivity, it sounds like. How did their unique environment influence their martial arts?
Well, the geography of the Indonesian archipelago, with its numerous islands and dense jungles surrounding volcanic mountains, was ideally suited for guerrilla warfare.
Makes sense. Close terrain.
This environment naturally fostered the development of highly mobile, lightly armed, and armored fighters, essentially creating the perfect conditions for a diverse range of martial arts to flourish. The need to navigate varied terrains and engage in close-quarters combat in dense environments likely shaped their techniques and strategies.
So the very landscape played a significant role in shaping their fighting styles and making them so diverse.
Absolutely. The fragmented geography and the constant need for adaptable combat techniques likely contributed to the many different and often highly lethal martial arts traditions of Indonesia, such as pencak silat and kuntao, which we can maybe touch on later.
Okay.
Now, let's address some common misconceptions surrounding martial arts. Popular culture often portrays them in ways that aren't entirely accurate. What are some of the key myths that your sources debunk?
Good point. We've all seen the movies where the seemingly defenseless hero effortlessly defeats a group of armed attackers. Is there any truth to this idea of unarmed supremacy?
The source is quite definitive on this point. The idea that true masters do not need any weapon is a fundamental misunderstanding of martial arts history and practicality.
Oh, okay.
While many modern martial arts schools today focus primarily or even exclusively on unarmed combat training, historically, weapons were of primary importance in most martial traditions.
Right, like the samurai.
Exactly. The belief that unarmed skills like karate or judo will guarantee victory against someone armed with a knife or even a firearm is described as a misinterpretation of the historical context of martial arts. Unarmed combat is simply not a guaranteed win against armed opponents.
That's a necessary dose of reality for those of us who enjoy action movies. What about the role of women in martial arts? Were they traditionally excluded, as they often were in other aspects of historical societies?
Interestingly, despite the societal inequalities that existed in many parts of Asia, the martial arts have been unusually open to women throughout history, according to the source.
Really? Surprising.
Yeah. Unarmed combat techniques have often been popular among oppressed groups as a means of self-defense that couldn't be easily detected or confiscated, and women certainly fit this description in many historical contexts. This allowed them a measure of agency and self-protection that might not have been otherwise available.
So for many women, martial arts provided a form of empowerment through self-defense.
Precisely. In Japan, for example, samurai women were trained in swordsmanship and the use of the naginata, a type of polearm.
Naginata, right?
They were expected to be able to defend themselves and their households in times of emergency. Even the appendants of noble women were trained to fight to protect their mistresses. Japanese mythology also includes numerous tales of female warriors who were as formidable as their male counterparts.
Wow.
Furthermore, the ninja, known for often defying social norms, extensively utilized female agents in both espionage and assassination missions, recognizing their unique abilities for such roles.
That's a valuable counter-narrative to the common perception of martial arts being exclusively a male domain. Now, another myth I've occasionally heard is that highly skilled martial artists have to register their hands as lethal weapons with the police. Is there any truth to that?
Huh. Yeah, the source explicitly states that the story about martial arts experts having to register their hands with law enforcement as if they were dangerous weapons is a complete myth.
Okay, good to know. Myth busted.
But there is a kernel of truth behind this misconception.
Oh.
The application of martial arts skills in a real-world altercation can certainly be considered excessive force or even lethal force under the law, depending on the circumstances.
Oh, the legal aspect.
The source provides a relevant example. Imagine a jiu-jitsu black belt involved in a bar fight. If he uses a reasonable amount of force, perhaps a simple joint lock, to subdue a drunken aggressor, that would likely be considered self-defense.
Okay. Reasonable force.
However, if he responds with violent martial arts techniques that inflict serious injury when he wasn't in genuine fear for his life, he could face legal repercussions for using unreasonable or excessive force.
So while there's no official registry for fists of fury, your level of training and skill can definitely influence how the law views your actions in a conflict situation.
Exactly. That's the important distinction.
That's an important distinction to make. Now, no discussion about martial arts and popular culture would be complete without mentioning the legendary Bruce Lee. What kind of impact did he have, according to your sources?
Bruce Lee's impact on the world of martial arts and its perception in the West was truly monumental, just huge.
Sure.
The source highlights his early struggles in Hollywood due to the prevalent racism of the time, which made it incredibly difficult for a Chinese man to secure leading roles.
Yeah, that was a tough era.
He eventually found international stardom in Hong Kong with iconic films like Fists of Fury and The Chinese Connection, which became massive hits across Asia and began to gain traction in the West.
And then he finally achieved his dream of breaking through in American cinema.
Yes. His ambition to make a significant impact on the American film industry was finally realized when he was offered the starring role in Enter the Dragon.
Ah, Enter the Dragon. Classic.
This film is described in the source as having become the definitive standard against which all subsequent martial arts films have been measured. His incredible charisma, his unique philosophy of Jeet Kune Do, and his undeniable skill and athleticism on screen. It all had a profound and lasting impact on popularizing martial arts in the Western world, inspiring countless people to take up various disciplines.
Absolutely. He brought a new level of awareness, respect, and excitement to the genre. Now, the source also makes a clear distinction between cinematic and realistic portrayals of martial arts. What are the key differences that are highlighted?
The source draws a very clear line, noting that cinematic martial arts frequently feature what are essentially superhuman abilities. Think of gravity-defying leaps, seemingly impossible feats of strength and speed,
Why, true.
and techniques that appear to completely disregard the laws of physics.
Yeah, exactly. In the context of the game system the source is based on, some martial arts styles even have different point costs depending on the campaign's intended level of realism, directly reflecting these more fantastical elements.
Interesting game mechanic tie-in.
And the source even points out that the reality of martial arts as depicted in comic books often goes far beyond even the most exaggerated cinematic portrayals, presenting characters with truly superhuman capabilities.
So what we typically see on the big screen is often a highly stylized and significantly exaggerated version of actual real-world martial arts practices. Generally, yes. While there are certainly real-world martial artists with incredible levels of skill and dedication, the over-the-top abilities so often depicted in film and comic books firmly reside in the realm of fantasy.
Right. Good to keep that separation clear.
Now, your sources go on to introduce a very diverse range of specific martial arts styles as examples. While we certainly don't have time to delve deeply into each one, let's touch on a few to give you a better sense of this fascinating diversity. Let's start with On Chi. What's particularly unique about that style?
Anqi sounds mysterious.
It is. On Chi is described as a secretive Chinese martial art that heavily emphasizes the use of hidden weapons and thrown projectiles.
Hidden weapons, okay. Like ninja stuff.
Its reliance on these concealed and unexpected tools draws an interesting parallel to the methods often associated with ninjutsu, yeah? It's said that masters of Anqi possess the skill to transform ordinary, everyday objects into deadly weapons with surprising speed and accuracy. In more cinematic game campaigns, practitioners can even learn specialized techniques like pressure points and power blow, specifically for use with thrown weapons.
Our bro with thrown weapons.
Cool. The source presents it as a somewhat incomplete style, often studied in conjunction with other kung fu forms, and it was historically linked to the Lin Kuei, which is portrayed as a kind of Chinese equivalent of ninja, sometimes referred to as forest demons.
Hidden weapons and turning everyday items into deadly projectiles. That definitely has a strong cinematic flavor to it. What about Bando, the martial art originating from Burma?
Bando, which comes from Burma, is highly regarded by military personnel for its practical effectiveness. It even carries the somewhat unusual nickname, the Jeep of the martial arts,
The Jeep, okay.
suggesting its ruggedness and versatility. It's a comprehensive system that combines self-defense techniques, unarmed combat sport applications, and training in the use of various weapons.
So very practical.
Very. The core combat philosophy of Bando emphasizes speed, deception, and a relentless series of continuous attacks, with primary targets being the opponent's legs, followed by the torso, and then the head. The overall goal is to achieve a swift and decisive victory, often by disabling limbs rather than necessarily inflicting lethal damage.
Speed and strikes designed to disable that sounds very efficient and favored by military thinking. Now, we absolutely have to mention Shaolin Kung Fu, given its legendary status in martial arts lore. What are its defining characteristics according to the source?
Shaolin Kung Fu, as we discussed earlier, has those mythical origins linked to Bodhidharma and the Shaolin Temple. It places a strong emphasis on the balanced development of both external physical strength and techniques, as well as internal spiritual cultivation and focus.
The internal-external balance.
Right. In more cinematic game settings, Shaolin practitioners are often depicted as capable of a wide array of extraordinary abilities, ranging from devastating power blows to the unpredictable and entertaining drunken fighting style.
Drunken fighting. Classic.
Considering all the legends surrounding the incredible powers attributed to the Shaolin monks, the source even playfully raises the question of how the Manchu dynasty ever managed to destroy their temple.
Good question. Definitely a recurring and popular image in martial arts cinema. What about Muay Thai, the well-known style from Thailand?
Muay Thai is described as a particularly brutal and highly effective Thai martial art that makes extensive use of kicks, punches, knees, elbows, and grappling techniques.
The art of 8 limbs, right?
Exactly. Practitioners undergo rigorous training to toughen their shins, making their kicks incredibly powerful and often targeting an opponent's legs and arms to cripple them and limit their mobility.
Ouch, toughened shins.
The source even refers to some of its techniques as being akin to dirty fighting due to their sheer effectiveness and focus on debilitating the opponent, highlighting its practical application as a self-defense form. It's presented as a very direct and physically demanding style that has produced some of today's most formidable stand-up fighters.
Sounds like you definitely wouldn't want to be on the receiving end of a well-placed Muay Thai kick. We've touched on ninjutsu earlier, but let's delve a little deeper into its specific characteristics as presented in your sources.
Okay. Ninjutsu, as a distinct style, heavily emphasizes stealth, disguise, and various forms of trickery, which aligns perfectly with our earlier discussion of the ninja.
Right, the non-combat skills.
But it also incorporates a diverse array of weapons, including various types of swords and knives, specialized and sometimes exotic tools, poisons, and even early forms of firearms.
Firearms, too. Interesting.
Yeah. While popular imagination often focuses heavily on the martial arts aspects of ninjutsu, the source reiterates the crucial importance of the ninja's skills in acting, deception, and blending into their surroundings.
So the actual fighting techniques are really just one component of the ninja's overall and highly specialized skill set.
Precisely. Now let's shift our geographical focus for a moment and look at savate, the martial art that originated in France.
Savate, that's one I don't know much about. French kickboxing.
Sort of, yeah. Savate is quite interesting because it has its roots in 18th century French street fighting, particularly among those who worked on the waterfronts of cities like Marseille.
Street fighting origins. Okay.
Over time, it gained popularity among the upper classes and became more formalized as a distinct martial art. Unlike many Asian martial arts traditions, Savate does not have any significant religious or mystical origins.
No mystical stuff.
Nope. Consequently, in a cinematic game setting, the trained by a master advantage isn't typically applicable to practitioners of this style. Its techniques primarily emphasize the use of kicks and hand strikes, reflecting its practical, street-based beginnings where footwear would have been common.
Street fighting that evolved into a refined martial art. That's a compelling origin story. Now let's go back to Japan and discuss jiu-jitsu. What are the defining characteristics of that style?
Jiu-jitsu is described as one of the oldest and most foundational Japanese martial arts. It was a core component of traditional military training for the samurai, alongside their weapon-based skills like swordsmanship and archery.
So really old and fundamental.
Right. A key characteristic of jiu-jitsu is that it doesn't have a single, unified body of techniques. Over centuries, hundreds of different schools and lineages developed, each with its own unique variations and specializations.
Lots of variations then.
Generally, however, jiu-jitsu focuses on the principle of using an opponent's force against them, employing a wide range of grappling techniques, joint locks, throws, and striking maneuvers designed to disable or subdue an adversary.
Grappling and locks.
And many jiu-jitsu schools also incorporate the study of atemi, which is the knowledge of vital points on the body, similar to the concept of pressure points in Chinese martial arts.
Atemi. Got it. So a very adaptable and diverse style with the core aim of neutralizing an opponent by any means necessary, often without relying on weapons. What about karate, which is one of the most widely recognized martial arts globally?
Karate, which literally translates to empty hand, originated in Okinawa and was later popularized in mainland Japan and subsequently throughout the Western world.
From Okinawa, right.
As it spread and evolved, various distinct branches and styles emerged, with some focusing primarily on sport and no-contact or light-contact tournament competition,
Sport karate.
while others continued to emphasize self-defense and practical combat effectiveness, and some attempting to find a balance between the two.
Different philosophies within karate.
Exactly. The source points out that because many early karate forms were adapted into do disciplines, emphasizing philosophical and spiritual development alongside technique, their direct self-defense value might have been somewhat overestimated in some contexts.
Interesting point about the do transformation potentially diluting self-defense.
Mm-hmm.
Different branches and focuses within the same overall art form. That makes sense given its widespread adoption and evolution. What about kendo? Is that purely focused on swordsmanship?
Yes, kendo is the Japanese way of the sword, focusing very specifically on the art of swordsmanship using a bamboo practice sword called a shinai.
The shinai, okay.
However, it goes far beyond just the physical techniques of sword fighting. Kendo places a significant emphasis on cultivating respect, discipline, and spiritual development through the rigorous practice of swordsmanship.
So the mental aspect is key.
Very much so. Interestingly, the source mentions that in kendo matches, the mental and spiritual contest of wills between opponents is often considered as important as their physical skill, and can sometimes even determine the outcome of a bout before any decisive blows are landed.
Wow. Mind games before the first strike. So it's as much a mental and spiritual discipline as it is a physical one. What about kobujutsu? That name sounds like it might involve some interesting weaponry.
You're absolutely right. Kobujutsu is an Okinawan martial art that primarily deals with techniques involving traditional Okinawan weapons.
Okinawan weapons, like what?
Students typically begin their training with the bow staff and then progress to other implements like the tonfa, sai, kama, sickles, and the nunchaku, which gained significant popularity in the West during the martial arts craze.
Ah, the nunchaku. Bruce Lee effect again.
Probably. The source also makes an interesting point that many of the weapons that are often associated with the ninja in popular culture are actually Okinawan in origin.
Really? Like which ones?
Well, things like the sai are often shown with ninja, but they're Okinawan kobujutsu tools. It highlights a fascinating cross-cultural connection, or maybe misconception.
Interesting how those weapon traditions have intertwined and been perceived over time. Now let's briefly touch on pencak silat, the dynamic martial art of the Malaysian archipelago. What makes that style particularly stand out?
Pencak silat is described as a very dynamic, diverse, and often highly lethal combat style. Unlike Kuntao, which has Chinese roots, Silat's origins are spread across the various ethnic groups and islands of the Malaysian archipelago, resulting in a vast number of distinct styles and
So
traditions.
super diverse, even within itself.
Extremely. These range from soft and flowing styles that share some similarities with Tai Chi to hard and more direct styles akin to kickboxing. The source also highlights the significant body of legend and folklore surrounding the supernatural abilities of highly skilled Silat masters in more cinematic campaign settings.
Supernatural abilities.
Yeah, making it one of the most potentially powerful and versatile martial arts in those kinds of games.
Supernatural abilities attributed to its masters. That definitely leans into the more fantastical and legendary aspects of martial arts. Finally, we have street fighting listed. What's the perspective on that?
Street fighting is presented as something fundamentally different from formal martial arts disciplines.
Also,
It's characterized as being undisciplined, unorthodox, and often brutal, consisting primarily of instinctively applied techniques and dirty tricks, driven by a primal desire to end a fight as quickly and decisively as possible.
no rules, basically.
Pretty much. While the influence of formal martial arts has undoubtedly seeped into street combat over time, it's been stripped down to its most basic and often viciously applied elements. It's definitely not something one learns in a traditional dojo or through structured training.
Sounds like the complete opposite end of the spectrum from the more philosophical and disciplined martial arts. Now, your sources also give us a glimpse into some optional combat rules that game masters can use. What are some of the more interesting ones?
There are quite a few interesting options. One set of rules deals with the concept of fatigue in prolonged fights, making fighters increasingly susceptible to knockouts and other negative effects as they become exhausted.
Fatigue rules.
Yeah.
That adds realism.
Another set introduces rules for Chembara-style combat, designed to emulate those dramatic, over-the-top sword fights against multiple opponents that are so common in certain types of cinema.
Champara, like fighting hordes of minions.
Exactly. There are also rules for handling multiple attacks in a more cinematic fashion, allowing highly skilled martial artists to unleash rapid flurries of blows or even reduce the time needed to prepare and fire missile weapons, reflecting their honed reflexes.
Sounds like some great tools for game masters to tailor the combat to the specific tone and style of their campaigns. What about the concept of being trained by a master? It seems to be mentioned in connection with unlocking some of the more extraordinary abilities.
The trained by a master advantage is quite significant in this context. It often serves as a prerequisite for accessing many of the more advanced and cinematic abilities and maneuvers associated with a particular martial arts style.
So it's like a gateway.
Yeah, generally it signifies a deep and intensive commitment to a specific tradition under the tutelage of a highly accomplished and knowledgeable instructor. It implies a level of understanding, skill, and perhaps even access to more esoteric or secret techniques that goes beyond standard levels of training.
So it's not just about learning the physical techniques, but also about inheriting a deeper level of knowledge and potentially unlocking more specialized and even legendary skills.
That's a good way to put it.
Finally, the source touches on how martial arts can be incorporated into various campaign settings for games. What are some of the examples provided?
The versatility of martial arts is really highlighted by its potential integration into a very wide range of genres. We see examples like fantasy settings, such as Earth mentioned in the source, where martial arts could be seamlessly combined with magic and mythical creatures.
Fantasy, kung fu monks.
Totally. It's a natural fit for special operations campaigns, adding a realistic and impactful close combat element to modern scenarios. Cliffhanger adventures set in 1930s China, with their emphasis on action and exotic locales, are another obvious application.
Pulp action.
You could even incorporate martial arts into horror settings, perhaps as a means of defense against supernatural threats, swashbuckler adventures, Old West stories.
Kung fu cowboys.
Why not? Time travel narratives, and even post-apocalyptic survivor-style settings where self-defense skills would be paramount.
Right.
The source really emphasizes that the core dedication, discipline, and skills of a martial artist can be compelling and relevant in almost any narrative context.
That really underscores how adaptable and universally appealing these traditions are. Okay, we have covered an incredible amount of ground in this deep dive, from ancient origins and philosophical underpinnings to cinematic interpretations and a diverse array of specific fighting styles. As we begin to wrap up, what are some of the key takeaways that you think our listeners should really remember?
Well, hopefully you now have a much richer and more nuanced understanding of the diverse world of martial arts. It's clearly far more than just learning how to fight. It encompasses profound philosophical underpinnings, deep historical roots that span centuries and cultures, and the remarkable dedication of those who strive for mastery. You've seen how different societies and environments have shaped unique approaches to combat and self-defense, and how these practices have evolved over time, even capturing our imaginations in popular culture.
Absolutely. For me, some of the most intriguing aspects were those legendary origin stories, like Bodhidharma's extraordinary meditation, the brutal and transformative training of the Shaolin monks.
That cauldron story, wow.
Right. The enigmatic world of the ninja and the diverse philosophies that have profoundly influenced these different styles, and the ongoing interplay between the grounded reality of martial arts and their often fantastical cinematic portrayals is always fascinating to consider.
And this deep dive has truly only scratched the surface of the vast amount of information contained within your sources. The GURPS Martial Arts Sourcebook is packed with even more details on specific fighting styles, individual techniques, and a wealth of ideas for incorporating martial arts into various game settings.
So much more to explore.
Definitely. We strongly encourage you to explore further based on whatever aspects particularly resonated with you today, whether it's the detailed history of a specific art, the underlying philosophy that guides it, or even the more extraordinary abilities attributed to its practitioners in different contexts.
And on that note, here's a final thought for you to consider. Given the incredibly long history and truly global presence of martial arts, and how deeply ingrained they are in so many different cultures, and even in our fictional storytelling, what does this tell us about the fundamental human need for both self-protection and the pursuit of physical and mental discipline?
Good question.
Is martial arts ultimately just about conflict, or does it tap into something much more profound within the human spirit, something that speaks to a deeper aspect of our nature? That's something to contemplate until our next deep dive. Thanks for joining us.